In August of 1878, Philadelphia simmered in the sweltering heat of late summer. The streets around Fairmount Avenue bustled with vendors, horse-drawn carts, and factory smoke. Just north of the city, enormous stone walls loomed over the neighborhood, walls so tall and thick that they seemed more medieval fortress than modern prison. This was Eastern State Penitentiary, a place designed not just to hold criminals but to reform souls through absolute isolation. Eastern State Penitentiary, a prison built on silence and solitude. Within those walls, a man named Timothy Boyle quietly plotted one of the most ingenious escapes in American prison history, exploiting nothing more than the monotony of routine and a giant barrel of trash. To appreciate Boyle's ingenuity, it's important to understand what Eastern State represented in the 19th century. When the prison opened in 1829, its founders, many of them Quakers, believed that solitary confinement would force convicts to reflect, repent, and become better people. Each prisoner lived alone in a single cell. Food was delivered through a small opening called a feeding hole. There were no doors connecting the cells to the central corridor. The cells had wooden floors and high arched ceilings resembling a chapel. Above each cell was a circular skylight called the Dead Eye, intended to symbolize the watchful eye of God. Prisoners spent 23 hours a day in these small rooms, leaving only for brief solitary exercise in a walled yard slightly larger than the cell itself. When inmates were moved, guards placed hoods over their heads so they could not see the layout of the prison or identify other prisoners. The silence was enforced ruthlessly. Even whispering through holes next to hot water pipes could result in punishments like confinement to a dark cell on bread and water, or even a straitjacket and gag. Guards wore wool socks over their shoes to muffle their footsteps. This regime broke many inmates. One prisoner later wrote that in the gloomy solitude of a sullen cell, there is not one redeeming principle. Despite these harsh conditions, work was compulsory. Prisoners made shoes, wove cloth, dyed textiles, or performed other trades under the overseer's watch. A man might spend his days making chair frames or mending old boots, then sleep on a simple bed attached to the wall. Meals were plain: bread, stew, sometimes turnips or cabbage, and eaten alone in the same room. For 2 half-hour breaks each day, inmates went through the iron door at the back of their cell to a small yard to feel sunlight and breathe fresh air. Every 2 weeks, prisoners were brought out, still hooded, to bathe. The walls between cells were 20 inches thick. This strict separation was known as the Pennsylvania system. Its architects believed that solitude would inspire penitence, hence the word penitentiary, but critics likened the experience to sensory deprivation. Over time, the system was modified, but in 1878 it still defined the daily experience of prisoners like Timothy Boyle. To someone confined under such conditions, the idea of curling up in a barrel of garbage might have seemed not only tolerable but liberating. This context helps us understand why Boyle risked suffocation and discovery. The darkness inside a hogshead was preferable to the endless loneliness of a cell. He would have watched the yard's daily patterns: guards pacing, inmates shoveling waste, and carts arriving to collect garbage. He noticed that certain barrels, called hogsheads, were used to store and transport rubbish. Hogsheads were enormous casks, typically used to store tobacco, rum, or molasses. They were large enough to hide a crouching adult. In industrial Philadelphia, old hogsheads were routinely repurposed to hold trash and rubble. Whether or not Boyle's pre-prison trade was truly dray work, he paid close attention to labor inside Eastern State. Some sources identify him as a former drayman before imprisonment, a driver of a dray, which is a low, flatbed wagon without sides pulled by horses or mules. Whether or not Boyle's pre-prison trade was truly dray work, he paid close attention to labor inside Eastern State. He would have watched the yard's daily patterns: guards pacing, inmates shoveling waste, and carts arriving to collect garbage. Boyle realized something. While guards were vigilant about inmates, they were far less attentive to the objects leaving the prison. Guards assumed that nothing of interest could hide in a barrel of rubbish. They were bored by routine and probably repelled by the smell. He understood that hogsheads could hold a grown man because he had loaded barrels in his previous life, or at the very least, watched them loaded in prison. The plan was incredibly risky. If the guards decided to spear the rubbish with a pole, he'd be discovered. If another prisoner told on him to curry favor, he'd face solitary confinement and a longer sentence. Picture a dark barrel lined with wood staves, full of jagged scraps and rotten waste, just large enough for a man to curl into a fetal position. Holding your breath in such a space was a test of will. Who was Timothy Boyle? Timothy Boyle isn't a household name like Al Capone or Slick Willie Sutton, but he left his own mark on Eastern State's history. According to later historians, Boyle had been convicted of second-degree murder. Contemporary sources differ on whether Boyle worked in the bakery or performed yard labor. However, all accounts agree that he knew enough about the prison's routines to see a glaring oversight. Some sources identify him as a former drayman before imprisonment, a driver of a dray, which is a low flatbed wagon without sides pulled by horses or mules. He would have watched the yard's daily patterns, guards pacing, inmates shoveling waste, and carts arriving to collect garbage. Hogsheads were enormous casks typically used to store tobacco, rum, or molasses. In the colonial tobacco trade, hogsheads were about 4 feet high and 4 feet in diameter, weighing roughly 1,000 pounds when filled. They were large enough to hide a crouching adult. In industrial Philadelphia, old hogsheads were routinely repurposed to hold trash and rubble. Boyle realized something. While guards were vigilant about inmates, they were far less attentive to the objects leaving the prison. He noted that the weight of a hogshead filled with rubbish might not be much different from an empty one covered with trash. The draymen worked by rote. The guards, trusting routine, hardly glanced at the cargo. Boyle weighed the risks against the prospect of spending many more years inside Eastern State's walls. He decided that his chance for freedom outweighed the dangers. On a hot morning in August 1878, prisoners were assigned to clean up duty in the yard. Boyle's moment had come. The plan was incredibly risky. Whether he had accomplices among other inmates is unclear, but some accounts suggest that fellow prisoners shoveled waste over him. During work detail, as hogsheads were being filled, Boyle slipped inside one of them. He would have folded his body, knees to chest, and lowered himself into the barrel. He had to remain completely still as rubbish rained down, each scrap muffling his presence. Other inmates might have deliberately positioned the hogshead he chose near the cart's edge to ensure it was loaded first and placed on top. Boyle's world lurched as the hogshead tipped and thudded onto the wooden bed. He had to suppress any groan or gasp that might betray him. The cart passed under the heavy iron arch, leaving the gloom of the yard behind. Outside, the sounds changed, from muffled steps and distant clanks to the bustling cacophony of city life. Vendors calling, horses snorting, the cries of children playing. Boyle was now outside Eastern State's walls for the first time since his conviction. Finally, when the cart stopped, perhaps at a dumping site or outside a workyard, Boyle pushed against the head of the hogshead. It lifted, just enough to let in a sliver of light. He eased it aside, inhaled fresh air, and climbed out. Then he stepped onto the cobblestone alley and walked away, just another man in work clothes blending into the crowd. In a matter of minutes he had gone from prisoner number unknown to a free man. The reaction inside Eastern State must have been immediate and furious. Once the next headcount revealed that a prisoner was missing, guards realized that the cart was the only means by which someone could have left unnoticed. But by then, Boyle had vanished into the anonymity of Philadelphia, a city of nearly 750,000 people. For the warden and guards, it was a humiliation. For Boyle, it was freedom. Contemporary reports about Boyle after his escape are scarce. The Hidden City article says he made good his escape. The Buzzsprout podcast transcript claims rumors placed him in Europe. Because he wasn't a notorious outlaw, he didn't become the subject of dime novels or Pinkerton manhunts. There are no records of his recapture. He simply disappeared. That's partly why his story remains obscure. Boyle was not the first man to slip out of Eastern State Penitentiary, nor the last. Each method exploited a different vulnerability: a disguised outfit, a distracted guard, a structural weakness. Boyle's method was arguably the least violent and most imaginative. What sets Boyle's escape apart is its reliance on routine. He didn't bribe a guard or smuggle a weapon. He used an object that guards saw every day, hogsheads of rubbish, and turned it into his getaway vehicle. In doing so, he highlighted a universal truth: complacency is a prison's weakness. The hogshead is a forgotten but important detail in this story. During the 18th and 19th centuries, hogsheads were essential for storing and transporting goods, especially tobacco. An article from the Scottsville Museum notes that hogsheads used for tobacco were large barrels about 4 feet high and 4 feet in diameter and weighed about 1,000 pounds when packed. As a former drayman, Boyle likely knew how hogsheads were balanced and how they felt when loaded. The severity of Eastern State's isolation gives context for Boyle's desperation. If a man like Boyle was willing to bury himself in garbage to escape, what does that say about the humane treatment of prisoners? Boyle's Escape teaches us several things about prisons and about people. Most importantly, Boyle's tale feels fresh because it predates film and remains largely unexploited in popular culture. Timothy Boyle's 1878 escape from Eastern State Penitentiary is a tale of quiet ingenuity. More than a century later, his Hogshead Escape still holds lessons about observation, complacency, and the human desire for freedom. More than a century later, his Hogshead Escape still holds lessons about observation, complacency, and the human desire for freedom.